This video is a Zer0 Plateaus production, jointly produced with content prepared by Conrad Hamilton and presented by Greg Taillon. Conrad is one of the 4 authors of the upcoming book, Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, which goes on sale April 24th. Its co-authors include Matt McManus, Ben Burgess, and Marian Trejo, and features a foreword by Slavoj Žižek. If the Peterson content of this video doesn't totally turn you off,
buy it.
Jordan Peterson often calls himself a classical liberal, or a classical British liberal, in contrast to some undefined liberal. But a basic problem with this label is how vague it is. Despite that, we can nevertheless still muster together some kind of definition based on the many classical British liberal philosophers there are. Whether that means Thomas Hobbes, or John Locke, or Bentham, Mill, Priestley, Price, or Paine, in alignment with philosophical liberalism tends to imply the shared assumption of a basic inherent dignity common to all people. How this basic dignity was conceptualized varied a great deal among these philosophers, but it was a relative constant within the tradition. However, erroneously or not, there have been moments when Peterson has been associated with the far right, and its shadowy sophomore brother, the alt-right. It was actually in response to an article by Business Insider magazine by Steve Kovac, where Peterson was lumped in with Stéphane Molyneux as members of the far right, that he wrote in to say that he was a classical British liberal when asked what his preferred label was. His lumping in with the bearers of tiki torches, however, is not totally unfounded. In a 2018 study by the nonpartisan Heterodox Academy, they do show that he still has influence among members of the far right, though they stop short of suggesting that he has any responsibility for their acts of violence. Peterson even maintains that he brings people back from the fringes of the far right, although I'm unaware of any time he's ever claimed to have successfully done this with someone from the far left. The prominence of Peterson's political prevarication, however, fades in significance when we consider the influence of Carl Jung, even in the political respect. For in this domain, Jung himself is not free of paradoxical formulations, having said,
As a Swiss, I'm an inveterate Democrat, yet I recognize that nature is aristocratic, and what is even more, esoteric.
To compare with the most well-known of the classical British liberal philosophers, Jung is not nearly so egalitarian in his view of nature or the structure of reality. So why then did he say, I am an inveterate Democrat?
Of course, technically, he was a sympathizer of National Socialism as well, but water under the bridge.
Thank you, Conrad. The answer to how Jung may be an inveterate Democrat, while still viewing nature or the structure of reality as aristocratic or deeply unequal, may lie in the embrace of paradox and competing desires within the field of psychoanalysis. Even if Jung thought nature or the structure of reality was deeply unequal, he nevertheless recognized the importance of believing in things which have an aspirational content. This schism is mirrored in Jung's conception of the self, or as Conrad puts it in his contribution to Myth and Mayhem. For Jung, the shadow refers to the unconscious, the way that it always trammels up what consciousness cannot, often becoming a repository of our darkest animal instincts. It's perhaps this way that we can best understand Peterson, as a thinker whose frequent disavowals of the alt-right betray an unsettling similarity, a projection onto others of something his ego cannot identify with. This similarity is not apparent in the exoteric side of Peterson's work, the platitudinous endorsements of milquetoast liberal capitalism that he's so fond of. But they are apparent in his deeply autarchic and biologistic view of the natural world, one that he often seems to dare audiences with.
Shadow, right? A kind of dark aspect of ourselves that's necessarily repressed in order for the self to be brought about. But this isn't conceptualized by Jung as purely a bad thing. Insofar as you can embrace something that has aspirational content without it totally overwhelming your capacity to soberly assess reality, that's actually something for him that is very good.
In the way then that for Jung, who is exoterically or outwardly democratic about the nature of politics in his own country, and esoterically or inwardly aristocratic about the nature or structure of reality, we may say likewise that there are 2 Petersons. An exoteric Peterson who defends the preservation of a liberal capitalist world order which nominally affords a minimum of freedoms to all peoples, and an esoteric Peterson who knows that whatever efforts are made, real equality, economic or otherwise, can never be achievable due to the fact that unequal distribution is baked into the very nature of reality itself.
He gave a talk at Lafayette College in March 2018, and there he was asked about the question of race and IQ. I don't like answering this kind of question because every time you do it, you get killed. He immediately digressed into a discussion about how we interpret statistical data, signature Peterson. And he said often when we discuss data, we succumb to what he describes as the tail problem. And the tail problem is the way that, if you take two populations that are even relatively similar, even one standard deviation of difference can manifest strongly at the extremes. So he says, for example, that the average man, the average woman, there's not too much of a difference in how violent or aggressive they are, but the 1% of people who are the most violent are invariably men.
As evidence, Peterson ultimately cites what must be the most politically correct example
of political correctness.
For someone to acknowledge the reality of race and IQ, Peterson points to the example of Ashkenazi Jews, who, he notes, are greatly overrepresented at the genius level of the IQ spectrum. This is Peterson at his most politically correct, and his savviest use of misdirection. For by leading with a point about the above-average performance of one off-targeted minority, he blunts the criticism that he's a race realist, and thereby offering cover for those who would target other minorities on the same basis of their alleged lower-than-average IQ. Even after all this, he still goes on to make the point that
the U.S. military will not hire individuals who have IQs under 83 because they deem them to be inadequately suited to perform the tasks associated with the military. Now, 10% of the population has IQs under 83. So for Peterson, what this proves is that a significant proportion, 10% of the population, is so poorly genetically disposed that we're going to have a very hard time in his description finding something for them to do. So what's fairly clear in Peterson's response to the question about race and IQ at Lafayette College is that insofar as there are IQ differences between different racial groups, that Peterson feels that these may have some basis in biology, that they are essential differences. And of course, there's lots of problems with this. Peterson's logical fallacy of choice in general is to take psychological or sociological studies that describe behavioral differences between different groups and to infer on this basis that there are essential differences between those groups. So for example, like if women go into, STEM fields less frequently than men, Peterson would be like, this is because this is how women are, something we have to accept. Well, actually, that doesn't really logically follow from that, but okay.
Even while Peterson admits the notorious difficulty of biologically separating one race from another, questions concerning the degree to which IQ is racially inherited are basically dismissed under the pretext that IQ testing is the best thing that we have. Let's recap. Looking again at the liberal thinkers of yore, one can build a working summary of liberalism, as political philosopher John Gray has, as being based on the values of individualism, meliorism, egalitarianism, and universalism. Thus we see Adam Smith habitually venerating the judgments of ordinary people, predicating that the good which capitalism incidentally provides is due to our innate capacities. Or to contrast that with Thomas Hobbes, he thought that even the immiseration of man was relatively equal, with one person about as capable as the next of killing the other. So what does Jordan Peterson have in mind when he says that liberal capitalism is the best of all possible worlds? It doesn't seem to be that it's because man's natural condition inures him to excel in this particular political configuration. A quick look in Peterson's Maps of Meaning may offer a clue. In it, he dismisses proto-liberal philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau's premise that an egalitarian, pre-civilizational man in the state of nature is corrupted by society, declaring it an ideal, an abstraction, archetypal and religious. For Peterson, man is, pace Rousseau, already deeply unequal, and disposed only to more inequalities. Thus it is that Peterson notes in his discussion at Lafayette College that even the US military doesn't regard 10% of the population, the rough amount of people with an IQ below 83, as sufficiently capable of killing each other.
This really gets to the core of Peterson's views. And what I want to suggest is that while many liberal thinkers might accept a certain level of inequality as a natural consequence of the affordance of freedoms, Peterson actually seems to think that inequality is good insofar as it's produced by our economic system.
Indeed, in the very beginning of 12 Rules for Life, in the very first chapter, Peterson connects the importance of standing up straight with your shoulders back to lobster battles in order to show that we must compete in similarly unforgiving environments where
the top 1% have as much loot as the bottom 50%, and where the richest 85 people have as much as the bottom 3.5 billion.
This is the background assumption, or esoteric side, from which Peterson openly expounds or delivers his exoteric content to the public. It is in this context that Peterson dismisses Rousseau in Maps of Meaning, because if nature isn't fundamentally inegalitarian, then liberal capitalism ceases to be justifiable on account of its indirect representative function. Indirect because if liberal capitalism were as brutal as nature, there wouldn't be much of a reason to support it. And representative because even while it still improves upon the state of nature, it reflects and reminds us of it. It's precisely this configuration which the likes of white supremacists seize upon in order to exploit the agenda of a political order of inequality premised upon a natural one. Liminally aware of this, Peterson adds caveats to this view by highlighting a particular group's positive traits, like the overrepresentation of geniuses among Ashkenazi Jews, who, along with black people, happen to be favorite targets of the alt-right. Or, conversely, to just dismiss the negative connotations of it by saying things like,
well, as far as I know, I haven't proven that there's any connection between intelligence and virtue. So, and just because people are different doesn't mean you should necessarily treat them differently.
Some consolation. But what really worsens this position is the fact that Peterson forecloses the possibility of a rearrangement of social or institutional conditions to address such disadvantages, whether biologically inherited or not, by suggesting that such changes inevitably lead to or court totalitarianism, which is in fact a deeply illiberal position. This, we could say, is Peterson's own deep shadow, the esoteric views which must be smoothed over with caveats for exoteric delivery. That position is what obtains such a defense that, sure, capitalism is unequal, but so are the lives of lobsters, and you're not getting pissed on in the face for the most part. So where we see that while many liberal thinkers might accept a certain level of inequality as a natural consequence of the affordance of freedoms to diverse peoples, Peterson's implicit position that this is defensible on the basis of its supposed reflection of the natural structure of reality severely undermines what claim he may have to any position of philosophic liberalism, and offers an uncomfortable affiliation to defenses of alt-right positions.
All this raises the question of how much Peterson can differentiate himself from the alt-right. Peterson says he's a liberal, and sure, he believes in equality of opportunity, formal legal equality, and so on. But he also believes that nature is so manifestly unequal that there's no way we could ever create anything like an equal social dispensation without creating totalitarianism, and that inequality extends to the domain of race, where we can see differences in biological intelligence. Peterson's not saying to the alt-right, your view of reality is wrong. What he's saying to them is your view of reality is right, but you've just derived the wrong political principles from it. If that's the case, can we really blame the alt-right for taking his views to their apotheosis, getting rid of the middleman, and simply trying to create a social order that directly manifests that kind of inequality? This much is clear. If the alt-right is, in Jungian terms, Peterson's shadow, he casts a long shadow over them too.